Alright, good day ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be taking our jelly bean candy dish, whatever it's called thing, and rendering it out. So this is a smaller version. You'll see it's 480 by 270. We want this to actually be a bit bigger because it's kind of tiny. But for the speed's sake, this only took 48 seconds, whereas the bigger size obviously is going to take longer to render out. So I'm going to go to my render settings, which is that button right there. And right now it's set to 960 by 540. We actually want to render this out at, scrolling way down, 8 by 10. That way we get 2400 pixels by 3000 pixels. And so we get this really nice looking rendering, hopefully, depends on what you've set up. Alright, so that's it. We're rendering a single frame out of this one instead of an animation. And under the quality tab, we're going to crank this up to 2. And then under the scene tab, we're going to scroll down to passes right here. And we're going to turn on depth, and we're going to turn on ambient occlusion. And what this will do is that when I render this, what is going to happen is that we're going to get some extra junk inside of our trunks. No, some extra junk inside of our scene. So I'm going to render this at a smaller size. That's what options, test resolution. 25%, so it'll render 25% of the normal size. And then what we can do is see what the thing looks like, and then adjust from there. Alright, so I turned my render settings down on that one. I went back to my render settings and cranked this down to 0.2, just so it would render out before I retired. It was taking a while. So, this is what it looks like, and if I zoom out a touch, you can see I've kind of seeing a little bit of the white or the black where this banner does not come up. And I'm actually pretty far away from my jelly bean, so I'm going to want to get closer in my final render. But this part here where I go to File, Load Render Pass, if I go to Ambient Occlusion, it pulls this up. And this is what ambient occlusion sort of looks like. Right now it's way too gray. Typically we want a black and white, not grayscale image like this. We want lots of blacks, lots of whites, and a little bit of gray. So I'm going to go to my render settings, and I'm going to go to my scene, and I'm going to take this max distance up. Now if I look at my scene here, and I look at where my grid is, I may need to go to show grid. It's on. Under display, there's like 17 spots. Grid is on. It may be really tiny. That's also a possibility. Yes, it is. It's right here. Right there. Okay, so if I set this to 5, 5 is actually probably maybe too small. I'll set this to 10. Okay, now in order for me to size up to see exactly what's going to render, I'm going to click on this blue circle, and I'm going to go to View, Camera Settings, and I'm going to say Vertical. Okay, now this is what's going to render. So I'm going to get really close like that, so I can actually see it, and then I'm going to render this again. So I'll pause it, I'm going to render this again, and then we'll come back when it's done. Alright, so now that finished rendering. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my file, load render pass, and go to ambient occlusion. And then this is something a little bit more acceptable. Mostly white, and then we get these like black areas with a little bit of gray. Okay, now what that's going to do in our final look of this is going to make it look a little bit more polished. You'll see. And then load render pass depth Z. This one is going to be completely white. We're not going to be able to see a single thing here. Okay. So that's my test. Okay. So I've tested this out, and that's what we want to do. So I set my AO max distance to 10. You can set yours to whatever it needs to get a very similar result. Okay. And under quality, I would crank this back up to 2, but for now I'm just going to leave it at 0.2 just so I can show this. And then open EXR is fine, zips is fine, name.extension is fine because we're only rendering one frame. 8 by 10, our perspective camera, because that's the one we're in, but if you had a separate camera set up, obviously you could do that too. We could make a brand new camera. Make sure the blue dot is clicked. Make sure the camera settings vertical is clicked so we can see what's in there. I can change my focal length to kind of give me a little bit more of a perspective to it. And then, shooting from below is going to give me a different look than shooting from above. Okay, so you want to kind of compose a nice shot. You don't want to be too far away. We obviously don't want to be that far back. There we go. Maybe something like this. Okay. And then I would pick perspective 1 from that list. And I can go to render and say batch render. And then it would go through and it would batch render this one frame out. All right. So I've already batch rendered, so I don't need to do that. So I'm going to go into a program called Nuke. Okay, so Nuke X 9.0.4. And this says, yes, you have a temporary license, that's fine. And so now what it's going to do is it's going to open up Nuke. So now there's a couple areas that we need to focus on. This up here is where we see stuff happen. This up down here is where we add stuff into the scene. And then this over here is properties where we can change stuff. So, and this is also mouse sensitive, so depending on where my mouse is, I'll get different results. So I'm going to make sure my mouse is down here. I'm going to hit the R key, and I'm going to go find my file. So it should be inside of my 2510, work, CandyJar, images. Now if you batch rendered, it would be right here, but I didn't batch render yet. So I'm just going to go to my temp folder, and I'm going to grab my latest one, which is that one. Okay. So here is my file. Now in order for me to see it, I have to connect it to the viewer. So I can grab these arrows and I can connect it like that, and there it is. Or what I can do is just click on this and hit the number 1, and that will pop it into there. Okay. Now the controls are the same as Maya in that we can move stuff around. So I'm holding Alt and left mouse button, and Alt and middle mouse button will let me zoom in and out. Okay. So we can do that down here as well. Now again, it's kind of like a sucky thing. We have to get used to this business, but we do. So what I want to do is I want to take this and I can look at my ambient occlusion. So way up here at the top, I go to ambient occlusion. There's the ambient occlusion. I go to this, I go to depth, and there's currently nothing showing, but if I pull this slider down, and I pull this slider down, wow, I'm really not seeing anything. There we go. We can start to see something kind of forming inside there, which is so far down we really can't see anything happening. Okay, so all we need to know that there is information there. Okay, if I move my mouse over this and I look at the red value, that value is changing. All right, and yours is going to change differently than mine is. So I'm going to switch this back to RGBA. And what I want to do is I want to click on this, I'm going to hit the tab key, and I'm going to hit shuffle. Okay, so what shuffle does is it allows me to go here and say ambient occlusion. So now I've actually pulled the ambient occlusion out of this file. This is an EXR. An EXR can house many different things inside it besides just the color information. Okay, now you'll notice that my shuffle has the 1 arrow connected to it. If I click back on here and hit 1, now that one has the 1 arrow. Click on this and hit 1, now that is. So that's what's cool about this, is that from anywhere we can kind of see what's happening. Okay. The big thing is looking at these arrows to see what the last step is, because that's where you want to see what the result is. So what I can do now is I want to take this shuffle and I want to multiply it on top of this. So I'm going to click on my shuffle, hit M for merge, and then I can connect the B. It's hard to see, but there's a B right there. The B of this to that. Okay. So what it's doing is it's just like in Photoshop where you have 2 layers on top of each other. This is doing an over operation. So we're actually seeing a blending between these 2 colors. So I don't want the over operation. What I want is a multiply. Okay. So now here's where it's kind of neat to be able to see before and after. So if I click on this one and hit 1, and I click on this one and hit 1, you can see there's a definite difference in what these look like. Okay. Now we can also use 1 and 2. So if I go here to 1, click this and hit 2, you'll see that I have a second connector to this. So I'm going to click off and just go 1, 2, 1, 2. And I'm seeing basically the before and after of what that ambient occlusion is doing. And you can see, wow, that really pops this thing a whole lot. It actually pops it and it locks it, which is very rare. This is very rare for that both to happen at the same time. So what I can do is take this mix over here down. If I decide it's maybe too much, I can pull it down a little bit. Okay, and then I can again switch back 1 and 2, 1 and 2, until I get happy results. Okay, and it also works up here because this is where we had some of that stuff happening. Now the reason this works, let me switch to my shuffle, is that these black areas are just going to darken our original image. Okay, so all these black areas just darken that area. So anywhere that the objects are touching each other, like down here or right there, it becomes very black. And so when it's multiplied, it darkens it, and we get a better contact shadow than we would have had otherwise. Get rid of this too. Okay, so that's step number 1, is that we did that, which is awesome. Then I'm going to click on my multiply, hit the tab key, and add a Z defocus. Okay, and I'm going to pull these down. Sometimes these get scrunched up. Now what the Z defocus is going to do is it's going to blur portions of this, kind of like a depth of field effect. Come on. There we go. All right, so I'm going to go to my stuff over here. For my math, I'm going to set this to direct. For my output, I'm going to set this to focal plane setup. And I get this little focal point, this little dot. And as I move this, what it's going to do is it's going to find the depth of that area. Okay, so now it's actually reading how far from the camera was that point in 3D. And then using the depth of field, I can pull areas into more of a focus. Now this goes up to 1, but I can type in more. I can type in 10 here if I wanted to, or 20. It really depends on your scene as to how much you want in focus. Now we're not seeing the depth of field happening. We use this focal plane setup just to get the dot in the right spot. And then I can change this to result. And now you'll see that we have these jelly beans are nice and blurry. And these jelly beans are crystal clear. And then the jar, even in the back and the top, is a little bit out of focus. Okay, so I can pull down the size of my blurring. I don't want it to be like incredibly blurry, but I do want just a hint of it. Just a little bit of softness up front. That's too much. I went too far. There we go. Now, a little bit of softness up front, and then some crispness back there, because it'll bring our eye right into this area. Okay? Now, this is going to take a little bit longer when you're working at full res. I'm working at a lower resolution, so it goes a bit quicker. So now what I can do is I'm happy with that. So then I can take this into, after my Z to focus, hit the tab key and do a write. Okay? So we read our footage in, then we can write our footage out. Okay, so we just come over here to the file, and I click the folder, and I tell this where I want it to go. So I'm going to put it just in my images folder. I'll say candy jar from nuke.tif. And then I'll render this out and hit OK. So this is going to render out just that image, just as it is. Perfect. Okay. Then I'm going to open up Photoshop. And this is just like an introduction to Nuke. You can do all the stuff I'm going to do in Photoshop inside Nuke, but I just didn't want to blow up your brains too early. I want you to kind of see the benefits of it. Now the same stuff we did inside of here, we could have done inside of Photoshop too, but again, there's a lot more that Nuke can do than Photoshop could. All the stuff that I did here, if I were to go back into Maya and change my camera angle like that, and then I re-rendered it, I could just come into Nuke and reload this file, and Nuke would automatically update all this other stuff. Okay, Photoshop doesn't do that. Photoshop, you'd have to redo your ambient occlusion, redo your depth of field, redo all your other stuff. Okay, one of the benefits of using that program. So in Photoshop, I'm going to go to my desktop, D drive here. There's my candy jar from Nuke. Alright, so I'm going to hide my guides. I'm going to hide my guides. It's thinking. It's considering hiding the guides. It's not sure if it's going to let me hide them. It's really just kind of, you know, seeing where our relationship is at, and then seeing if it wants to hide the guides. Alright, so it did hide the guides after some coercing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my background layer. So I have 2 of them. I'm going to put a mask on this one. And on the mask, I'm going to fill this with complete blackness. So there's no change. You don't see anything different. But what I'm going to do to this one is I'm going to set this to be a multiply. Okay. So this is multiplying this image times that. Because there's a black mask on this one, we don't see anything. But as I go through my paintbrush, and I have a big brush, I have my flow pretty far down, like there. As I paint with white, you'll see that this is darkening the image. Okay? So I'm going to hit undo. What I want to do is darken the edges of this. Okay, so I'm just creating basically this dark area around my image. Okay, now if we look at the before and after, you can see the center stays pretty much untouched, but the outer ring is getting a bit darker. And so what that's doing is creating a little vignette. All right, now we can make a new layer, and I can actually go in here and we pop in a little bit of black here. Okay, that's the cool thing about Photoshop, is that we can just paint right on it, and it's kind of like your bread and butter tool where you can really just get in there and just start playing with stuff to really create some cool things, because you already know the foundational stuff. If you haven't played with Photoshop in a while, you need to get back into it. It ain't going away. All right. So now I can take my fill down some. Maybe it's, you know, a little bit too dark. That's cool. Okay. So here's where we started off. There's where we ended up. It looks a lot more poppier, punchier this way. We could also add stuff like curves. So I can add a curves to the top of this. And I can adjust my coloration on here. Ooh, fancy. Okay. And again, we always want to look at the before and after to see what the results are. I don't think I like the curves on this one. We could also do a hue and saturation if we wanted to maybe shift the color of our stuff. Or desaturate it. Maybe it's just too saturated. Maybe it's too vibrant. We want to pull it back a little bit. Before, after. Okay. I like it actually a bit desaturated, but maybe not that much. Maybe like that. Okay. That seems a little bit more realistic with that saturation in there. And if you're not aware inside of Photoshop, you can actually click on this guy, and I could click and drag just on a specific color. So like my blues are heavily saturated now. Now their blues are desaturated. So it's very cool you can do that, just kind of like pick a color and there you go. So that's cool. Alright, so then I'm just going to save this out. So I'm going to save as Sarcona _ final candy jar. I'm saving it as a TIFF. I don't need layers. I'll hit save. And then that's what you're going to turn in, is that final image. Okay, so that's what you're going to do. So we render it inside Maya at the 8x10 size. Make sure your quality settings are up. We rendered it with ambient occlusion, which we pulled out inside Nuke. We multiplied it. We Z to focus to get some blurriness, and then we wrote it out. We brought it into Photoshop. We multiplied this on top of itself just to kind of darken some of those areas. We added a little vignette. Then we did a little hue and saturation adjustment. Okay. You don't need to do all of those, but you do need to do something to it to enhance the image. All right. So that's how we render out our candy jar.